So here's the first principle. The cosmos, when I say cosmos, I mean space, nature, the body, the whole thing, is created and governed by basic patterns. Here's the trick. To say patterns, we mean patterns of motion. That's really what we're talking about. And we're talking about space-time motion. Why do we say space-time? Not just to be cool and make it sound a little more interesting, but in the Neijing, they say when motion slows down, like in winter, time slows down. And when it speeds up, time speeds up. That actually has a clinical relevance. When I am working on the skin out on the surface where things are moving faster, I can do things faster. When I'm working on a bone problem, and my needle's deep, I have to slow down my timing of treatment to match, to sync up with the slowed down time of a northern direction tissue of something deep in the body. That is actually the key that unlocked the whole Neijing for me. So I would say for the first 5 or 6 years, I was really lost. And then one day I realized all these things they're talking about patterns, and the patterns are patterns of motion. That idea is what I call the holographic translation perspective. And you need this in these classical texts. That means you need to have a point of view. There's so many ways that you can interpret any passage that if you don't have a guiding point of view, you're kind of lost. And this thing was like a key in a lock. And what does holographic translation perspective mean? It means that if I open the Neijing anywhere and give it to you and you read a sentence, we can understand that sentence through the perspective of motion, of space-time motion. And then that means when we're looking at how to translate something, all the possibilities, we have a way to go. And that just opened up everything. These patterns follow rules. So the Neijing's telling you the rules about the patterns. That means the universe is knowable to us. It's not random. And the vast majority of the patterns of the universe of motion are invisible to us. They're intangible. We don't see them directly through our senses. Instead, we know them through the things they create. So this is actually the basis of Neijing science. It's to look at nature in a very detailed way, see things like stars, trees, rivers, plants, and then discern the patterns of motion that made those things. That's kind of key. When we give the year-long class that we're starting soon, there's different levels that we teach on. And one level is technical knowledge. Like there's a lot of anatomy, for example. But another is that I need a year to teach you the foundations because we have to change your orientation from a Western way of seeing the world, where it's all about things, to seeing things that are invisible. And that takes a while. You just have to do it over and over. It's a practice. That means, for example, if you pick up the paper today and some politician has done a certain thing or something's happening or it's about climate change, the early Chinese way of thinking is immediately translate all that into patterns of motion. And that's actually the realm in which magic happens in Chinese medicine. By magic, I don't mean something unknowable. I mean, you did something and oh my God, the effect was like so amazing. The illness went away. I mean, all of us in Chinese medicine have had this experience. If you've been in practice long enough, most days you're doing pretty good. And then one day you do this thing and the person comes back and says, what did you do? Like that thing is completely gone. All traces of it are gone. And then you try and do the same thing again, and it doesn't work. Usually that's because you've hit the pattern that's behind the illness and changed it. So if you look at things, if you look up in the stars and you see lights and you see planets, they are being created and moved around by patterns that you don't see. If you look at the weather, for example, and you see a cloud moving, The clouds are not moving themselves. They are being moved by patterns of forces of motion that you don't see, but you can see the patterns of motion in the clouds. You can read them. If you look at a wave in the ocean, the wave does not make itself. It's created by patterns of motion that make it. So this is the basic way of thinking. That also means that when I see a patient, my job as an aging practitioner is to take everything I see and translate it into patterns of motion. That's sometimes hard because, say, for example, the patient comes and they have a very serious illness like COVID, they're in the hospital, cancer. All eyes are going to be focused on the cancer or the COVID. The doctor's going to tell you it's important, the patient, their family, you're going to feel a kind of panic. I got to deal with that thing. And the aging approach is always to take a breath and say, things that appear happen from patterns, and I need to look at the patterns. That's the meditation that we do every day in our work. Here's the chapter I was reading when I came to that conclusion that opened up the whole aging text for me, gave me that holographic perspective. And it's chapter 26 of the Suen, and they're talking about the influence of the celestial bodies on the body. So let's just read this. The Yellow Emperor said, when using needles, one must obey certain laws and rules. What are these laws and rules? And Shibo, his teacher, says, the laws, the Fa, come from heaven. The rules, the Zi, come from earth. Together they accord with the patterns of the Tianguang, the heavenly lights, which means the stars, the planets, the sun. And the Yellow Emperor says, I wish to hear more of this. And Shibo says, the general rule of the Fa of piercing is this, that you must first know the different conditions of the sun, moon, stars, celestial bodies, 4 seasons, and the chi of the 8 cardinal positions, which is like north, northwest, south, etc. Only when the chi of these various situations is correctly assessed can one proceed with piercing. What does this mean? You're assessing a chi field, patterns of motion that includes both the heavens, the stars, the sun, and the local nature that you're in. In accordance with these patterns, when the heavens are warm and the sun is bright and the blood in the body is thick and moist, kind of like a swamp, and the defensive chi floats to the surface. Thus, at this time, the blood is easily drained and the chi circulates freely. When the heavens are cold and the sun is obscured, the blood becomes congealed and stagnant, and the defensive chi sinks within. When the moon is new, the blood and the chi start to build their essence, and the chi begins to circulate. When the shape or the outline, the border of the moon is full, the blood and chi are replete, and the flesh is firm. When the outline of the moon is empty, the fullness of the flesh diminishes. The channels and collaterals become vacuous, the defensive chi departs the surface, and the physical form of the body is all that remains. This is the reason why in practice, the blood and chi are regulated in accordance with the patterns of the Tianshi, the heavenly rhythms. Therefore, when the heavens are cold, do not pierce. When the heavens are warm, do not hesitate. When the moon is full, is newly born, do not drain. When the moon is full, do not supplement. When the moon is empty, do not treat at all. This is the way of treating by the so-called method of perceiving the time and adjusting the method. For this reason, one must follow the order of heaven and the corresponding rhythms of abundance and vacuity. Ascertaining the movements of the heavenly illuminations, one must wait the correct configuration for treatment. Thus, if the moon is newly born and one employs a draining method, it is called Zong organ vacuity. You're going to make the organs empty. When the border of the moon is full and one employs a supplementing method at a time when the blood and qi are ascending and overflowing and the collaterals are full of blood, it is called double or heavy repletion. You're doing it way too much. When the border of the moon is empty and one treats, this creates so-called channel disorder pattern. When this occurs, yin and yang become mutually intertwined. They're supposed to be separate, have their own clear movements. When this occurs, what is true and pathogenic no longer exist separately, and together they sink into the interior to arrive and remain deeply within. So there's not a energy that's pushing out the pathogens. They just start they wrestle together, they get stuck together and they sink into the body. And this condition creates vacuity in the exterior and chaos in the interior. When this occurs, the proliferation of excess pathogens will arise. So let's think about this for a second. You know, one thing is to say, yeah, it's all this it's the same kind of ancient poetry. It feels good, it sounds right. Yeah, well, we want to live in harmony with nature. But then when you start to break it down in a technical way, you start to see more there. What does it mean when the moon is changing all of these things? It means that there's a connection, a direct connection between your body and the moon and the stars and the sun. And that connection is actually invisible. You know, the moon is not reaching out and doing something. It's an invisible pattern. It's in a field of qi and it's doing something. If you remember, one of the things I said was in the validation steps, you have to find a correlation in nature. So I had to go look and see, does the moon changing actually do anything like this? And it turns out, yes. And in early days of the Earth, the moon was actually much closer to the Earth, and people have calculated that the Earth swelled 200 feet every time the moon passed over it. So there was this kind of effect on the body. And you can also say, what's the difference between the sun and the moon on the body? So you can start asking technical questions. The moon seems to control this swelling and going back and forth. But for example, if the moon is in a certain phase, and you do the wrong treatment, you can drain your organs. And I have to say, the first thing when I read this passage was like, I've never done this, and I don't know any practitioner who does this. But if we take the Neijing text seriously, we should. And it actually has changed my treatment, because they're talking about the seasons of the moon. You can also talk about the seasons of the year. You can also talk about the times of the day. They're all very similar. It means in the wintertime, you shouldn't be doing much treatment. Also, if we want to expel pathogens, we try and do it in the spring and the summer. And there's a lot of different things we've changed on the passage here. But the main thing is, if you read this passage, what they're talking about is intangible patterns of motion affecting each other. And that's what kind of brought it my aha moment about how to translate the book.